This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 40.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, it's Matt. Thanks for joining me in session 40 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. I've got a great interview in store for you today with Mark Dixon and Dana Paliliunas. Now, longtime listeners will remember Mark from his two previous appearances on the show, and he is back with his co-author of the latest book from Shawnee Scientific Press. It's called the AIM Program, and that stands for Accept, Identify, and Move. And the AIM program is a synthesis of mindfulness, acceptance and commitment therapy, and applied behavior analysis to promote positive behavior change in children. And I'm not going to get too much into the detail of this curriculum. We have a very lengthy podcast episode today, so we're going to get into pretty good detail, so I won't spoil it here. But I will tell you that I do have an excerpt of the curriculum, and it looks like really, really good stuff. So I suggest you check it out if it's something that fits your needs. It is on sale today, and you can pick it up at squareup.com/store/Shawnee Scientific Press. Now, if that sounds like a mouthful, well, you're right. It is. And so what you can do, you can head over to behavioralobservations.com and look for session 40, and I'll have the link in the show notes there. Now, if it sounds like I'm really bullish on this curriculum, it's not because they're a sponsor, which they're not. It's just because I'm really interested in seeing people get good materials in their hands to help kids. So, again, if you want to check it out, you can go to squareup.com, that lengthy URL that I just mentioned, or you can go to behavioralobservations.com, session 40, and check out all the links there. So, before we get to the episode itself, I do want to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by Chartlytics. And we talked a lot about Chartlytics in the last episode of the podcast. And more generally, I got tons of great feedback from you guys responding to the appearance of Dr. Rick Cabina, talking about all things precision teaching and acceleration charting and all that fun stuff. I hope I didn't embarrass myself too badly with my lack of knowledge in that area. But so I'm trying to remediate that at the 2-day workshop that Chartlytics is putting on in Las Vegas. So if you're heading out to that, I hope to see you there. And they're going to do a few others. I think there's one in Miami and one in Pittsburgh coming up as well. And you can go to chartlytics.com/events to see the future workshop offerings that they have. But they also put together a cool, what they're calling a starter package for folks who are looking to dip their toe into precision teaching waters. And so if you go to chartlytics.com/Matt, they've got a couple of freebies that they want to give away. Well, one of the cool things, it's not a giveaway or anything like that. It's a video that's on there that shows some really kind of everyday applications of the Chartlytics technology at a clinic that serves kiddos with autism. And it's really eye-opening, and it's really well done. But they've also got a free webinar with Rick Cabina and Dr. Amanda Kelly, two-time podcast guest, a.k.a. the Behavior Babe. And that webinar is good for one Type 2 continuing education unit. So you can check it out there at chartlytics.com/Matt. And they're also giving away a free ebook on precision teaching. So if you want to learn more about precision teaching and you're looking, again, just to dip your toe in that water, you can go to chartlytics.com/Matt and get started there. So I think that's it for opening remarks here. And without any further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Dana and Mark. All right, Mark Dixon and Dana Paliliunas, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Or I should say welcome back, Mark, and welcome for the first time, Dana. Thanks for joining me, guys, today.
Thanks for having us.
So, Dana, Mark is kind of, I don't want to say old news, but he's a known quantity to listeners of the show. This is his third appearance on the podcast. So what I'd like to do is to give you a minute to kind of introduce yourself to the audience and tell us how you got into behavior analysis and how you discovered this ACT thing, and kind of just trace the arc to that point when you got into the field to kind of what you're doing now.
Well, in my undergraduate studies, I studied special education. And while I did that, I actually worked as an ABA therapist all throughout college. And the longer I did that, the more I loved it. And so almost immediately after I finished my undergrad, I started teaching, and I went back to start my master's in behavior analysis with Dr. Dixon here. And while doing that, I started to be exposed to, ACT and relational frame theory, and all of the awesome stuff that's going on in behavior analysis today. And as I finished my master's, I realized I needed to go back and get my PhD. So I stopped teaching and moved down to Carbondale at SIU, and I've been studying ACT and RFT ever since.
Very cool. So just to kind of rewind just a second. So when you were became an ABA therapist, were those jobs kind of like readily available at the time, or how did you, did you have to like figure out what is ABA first? I'm always curious about how people actually discover or step into or fall into or back into or whatever, whatever phrase you want to use. So what was the ABA scene like when you kind of got into the field, I guess is what I'm rambling towards.
I completely fell into it. As someone who was studying special education, I actually had a family friend who knew a family who had a son with who had autism, and they were always looking for therapists to work with their child. So I kind of met them through a family friend, and then was trained by someone who did ABA. And just over time started working for different companies. Once you're in, you kind of start making all of those connections.
Sure.
But it really started just, I happened to know someone who happened to need someone to just do ABA with their child. And it's all kind of just spiraled from there.
I see. Pretty cool. So we're here to talk about this awesome book that you guys put together, and we'll get into the title in a second. But I have to say, so I got this. So for just to kind of talk to the listeners here for a second to give them some context, these guys sent me a sample of the book, which had excerpts from different sections of it. And you guys did a great job kind of leaving me hanging, because there was one part where, yeah, it's like a trailer. But like there was one part of, I was reading, and it went from like page 5 to like page 47 or something like that. And I really wanted to get to page 6 because it was looking like really, really good stuff. So so I'm done. Long story short, I'm dying to learn more about the scope of the book and what it's about and things like that. So it's called the AIM program. So why don't you guys take a second and kind of tell us what AIM means and the kind of general gist of the book.
Sure. Well, AIM is it stands for accept, identify, and move, and that is kind of the overarching philosophy of what we want persons that are exposed to this curriculum to do. And before I get to what that all entails, let me take you a few years back, or actually probably a decade back, to where this all started. Around the same time I was developing the P curriculum, I had similar demands on me for working with these higher functioning and very challenging kids in school systems that were being told they need ABA, but they could talk and they were doing great academically, and they were having low incidences of significantly intense, challenging behavior. And so they were coming to me and saying, well, can we just do this peak thing, or, this ABA thing on them? And I thought, well, God, I guess we could, but it's not going to really make any difference. And, it was kind of left with demand and not necessarily a solution to work with these kids. Now, I knew that what they really needed was ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, but to try to roll that out into a classroom seemed like an impossible feat. Even to roll it out into behavior analysis is an impossible feat. And so how do you take a school teacher and and kind of nudge them to the idea that, maybe you should be doing some of these, higher level complex behavioral process developments with kids in classrooms. And how are you going to put that into your day? And then when you start looking at what these guys are doing, it's, a lot of what they do, in terms of generic classroom management is completely against the philosophy of acceptance and the basic principles that we were trying to get, or that we would try to get to, using an ACT type model. And so while I started to try to articulate what ACT was to these teachers and these staff, I also needed to make commentaries regarding the rest of what was going on in those rooms. There was not a functional account of behavior. It was a topographical intervention at best. It was a generic intervention for everybody in those classrooms. Everybody's going to work for the movie on Friday. And then on Tuesday, people are telling you to go to hell because they don't care about what's happening on Friday. And then the realization that, to try to dive into some of this some of this ACT stuff was so heavy that it might be more palatable if it was pitched as well as maybe stepped into initially under the umbrella of mindfulness. And so all these things were kind of converging at the same time, where we had these classrooms with these really intense kids. They were doing some really silly types of interventions with them that, any behavior analyst would just kind of chuckle at, red light, green light, yellow light, stoplight, behavior management things.
Did they have the clip chart where I see that once from sometimes, they start out in green, then you clip down or clip up based on that one. I just saw that recently. I'm like, yeah, we might want to rethink how we do this here.
Yeah, no, it's terrible, and probably the best abuse of, or just kind of abuse of that philosophy that I ever saw was a McDonald's fry container that contained clothespins that were the fries. And if you didn't have any fries left by the end of the day, you were bad and had to go home early. So, what way to, promote obesity and, just problem behavior, it's just the stupidest thing I ever saw.
That's right. There's my ticket home.
Yeah, that's right. No fries, send me home. So that, all kind of wrapped up together into this, thought of overhauling some of these classrooms, from a philosophical level to a mechanical level of what are you going to do every day, and how could we take the most contemporary behavioral science information that we had for this kind of population and put it in the hands of people that need it the most.
So Mark, before you continue on here, can you describe the setting? Was this a public school? Was this a separate environment, or can you take a minute and just kind of talk about the types of kiddos, the types of teachers, the types of environments that you're speaking to?
Yeah, I mean, these initially were public schools. They were, the ED, BD type classroom, emotional disorder, behavior disorder type classroom in the public school setting. And they were coming to me saying, hey, well, you're the behavior analyst. Can we just do some of this ABA stuff in these rooms? And I thought, well, I guess we could teach tax commands to these kids, but they're just going to man to go home and tack for you to go to hell. So,
or worse,
or even worse. So, I think that, it was a kind of a slap of reality that, we needed to scale up the types of interventions we were doing, or we just ignored this whole population of kids. And, I knew what the solution was, but it was going to be something that was going to take, quite a large, kind of packaging of technical vocabulary and science in order to get people that had no clue about what this stuff was to understand it.
So to that end, what I did garner from the book sample is that it basically incorporates ACT, mindfulness and behavior analysis. And to some extent, if I'm reading it correctly, even delve into some delay discounting, or at least you speak to that using layman's terms. So the impression I got as I was kind of flipping through this is like, my God, this is crazy. What's the word I'm looking for? not just crazy, but it was very ambitious, I guess, is where I'm going, right? Like, can you talk to I mean, that's a pretty tall order to pull that off. So how did you, I guess, for lack of a better word, operationalize these things in such a way, or describe these things in such a way, uh, uh, because I'm thinking the intended audience is that of a layperson as it relates to someone's knowledge of behavior analysis and ACT, et cetera. So I'm wondering if there's a lesson for dissemination embedded in the answer here. But like, how did you guys conceptualize that? We have these huge things that people spend decades studying with many, many doctoral dissertations and master's theses, et cetera, being generated and things like that. And we want to put this together in a manualized curricula.
Sure.
So can you speak to the challenge of that?
Yeah, so let me kind of continue on the history, because I think it speaks to how this thing evolved, and then how Dana became part of the adventure along the way as well. After knowing what needed to be done with these kids, and staff, or at least the administrator, saying, "Sure, you can do it." I had staff saying, "Well, what do I say and what do I do, and how? Okay, this all sounds nice. It sounds kind of touchy feely, and I can kind of relate to it. How am I going to pull this off tomorrow?" And so I realized, dang it, I guess I got to like give them scripts about what to say. And I get, and because they don't necessarily understand ACT, and we may spend 2 or 3 days in a training, but they could get it conceptually, but how are they going to actually deliver this thing to the kids? And again, they're not therapists; they're school teachers. And so, how do we make it fun? How do we make it portable? How do we make it accessible to kids that, I mean, some of these guys are, they have ankle bracelets on, they're on probation, they're pretty tough. And how do you get them to talk about their feelings, and care about these kind of, heavy, heavy subjects that evolve when you're doing some of this work? And so, what ended up happening was I started creating, the list of 184 days worth of ACT that eventually evolved into the 2014 book that I published, ACT for Kids with Autism and Social Emotional Conditions. And that book was one that solely kind of gave readers a list of 184 days worth of stuff to do across various age spans. And so that was, the outcome of some of these early classroom experiences that I had was, how do we talk to the little kid? How do we talk to the middle school kid? How do we talk to the high school kids using ACT language? Now, once that book came out, and actually while it was, even before it came out, as I was going back into these types of classrooms, people were saying to me, "Well, you want me to tear down my stoplight system? What am I going to put it there instead? And you want me to talk about functions of behavior? Well, what are those? And how do I get rid of the movie on Friday? What am I supposed to replace it with?" And so all of these things were starting to percolate after the initial kind of makeover, which was start doing ACT with these kids. They need it, and because this is behavioral, this is a good thing. This is going to be, I think, valuable for the kids. And so all these other kind of demands were getting pushed on me. Like, well, what about, are we supposed to keep them on a level system? Are we supposed to give them tokens? Are we supposed to give them points? And so all of these various items were being developed, but they were premature for a release in that 2014 book. They weren't standardized. We were still playing around with these things in a variety of ways. And I felt at the time that the population that first book was really designed for was, higher functioning kids with autism, and some related emotional conditions. And there was this other group of kids that was being missed by that book, as well as missed by our interventionists, that could really benefit from it. That larger population that struggles with social and emotional challenges. Once that happened, and we kind of started to make movements across all areas of the classrooms, the token economy, getting rid of these level systems, the functional account of behavior, and then putting ACT in place on a daily basis. We started having administrators come to me and say, can we do this with everybody in school? Can we do this with with everybody in the entire district? And at that time, I was like, oh God, I think we can, but let me rethink what that all means and how do we move from something that was now almost aggressively therapeutic to something that was a little bit more palatable for a 14-year-old kid that just might be having some troubles in math. And so at that point, I kind of looped in Dana, who had been, again, a master's student of mine and currently a doc student of mine that has, had quite a bit of experience in classroom settings, in public school settings, to now kind of massage what I had been working on for about 10 years into a very user-friendly, palatable system that could transcend those kids that had the ED, conditions all the way to, kids on the honor roll that just might be kind of nervous about going to cheerleading practice. And so how could we take this thing and scale it up even more so than we had in the past?
Cool. Was this, uh, well, I think this might be a good point in time to kind of walk through the different components of what AIM means, and because there's a lot going on as it relates to. It looks like there's like a little kind of tutorial about ACT. There's point charts. There's ABC sheets with a little bit of a twist on them. Um, so let's take a step back from kind of the aerial view and get on the I guess ground level here and talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of what this is all about.
Well, to get back to the acronym, I guess, accept, identify, move, that really gets at the core of, I think, ACT and what we want to see in terms of behavior change. So, to teach that idea of acceptance and being mindful of your own behavior and what's going on around you, kind of being the first main component, and then being able to identify what it is that matters to you, what are in the big picture your values, or for younger kids or people just starting out in this kind of system, what is it? What are your reinforcers? What is it you like to work for? So being able to identify those things, and then finally to move or to engage in adaptive, flexible behavior that gets you access to those reinforcers and those valued items on a regular basis. That I think is really kind of the foundation of everything that we designed in terms of, we have mindfulness activities, we have ACT daily lessons, we have a function-based point system, and all of that is really interwoven under this umbrella of being aware of what's going on around you, knowing what you're working toward, and being able to actually do it.
Okay, so does the um, is this something that is I did notice that there's like a mentions of various tiers and things like that, if I'm not mistaken. Is this something that can be incorporated into like an RTI model or something like that, or was this like a reaction or alternative to something like PBIS, where they do have that kind of pyramidal intervention model with different levels of intensity in terms of its approach?
Uh, Yes, we do have different tiers built within the AIM system, particularly for the ACT lessons. Each daily activity is actually broken down into 3 different tiers. So you have that first tier, which is kind of analogous to that school-wide idea of this is something everybody in the building is going to contact today. And then there's that second tier, which is focused more on teaching the concepts of ACT to kids who might need some instruction in these areas and would benefit from engaging in developing social emotional skills. And then there's that third tier, which is focused more on the specific behavior problems that kids might experience and getting them to really interact with ACT for their own personal behavior. So it does have that kind of buildup of intensity through 3 different tiers.
Right. Yeah. That first tier is something that could be done, and the way we designed it was it could be emitted by the principal on morning announcements in a school building, or it could be something that a parent might say to their child as they're getting ready for school. So it's literally a few sentences to try to orientate the kid to things that really matter. Remember, the more that you are, you think about what happened yesterday, the more you miss out on today. So just kind of little mottos that can help, recenter the child to moving towards reinforcers that they have stated are important in their day or important in their life. With and then going up to the third tier, which is, group wide, or one-on-one ABA, therapist-led interventions that are going to be experiential. There's going to be a variety of hands-on physical, activities, something that's going to take some time to do. And we designed it to be about a 20-30 minute experience. So it can scale up or down depending on the severity of the child you're working with, as well as the amount of time you have and how big you're trying to implement this.
I see. So within a given school setting, some kids might come into contact with a very small portion of this, whereas others, based on their needs, might have a more intense level of engagement in the curriculum.
Right.
Okay.
So
Got
like
it.
in my initial book, in that 2014 book, it was designed to be that kind of heavy intensive intervention across different ages. And here what we did, and what Dana really aided my development of, was taking those big intensive intervention activities, and then how do we tier them to these bigger implementation scales, as well as to tier them to kids that might be doing relatively okay out there. They could just use a little nudge rather than a full scale intensive intervention.
Got it. So have you guys done any research on this? And if so, what have you found thus far?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a variety of research studies on this. As I did with Peak, kind of kept things pretty much under wrap until the books were ready to come out. So that we've got a series of papers that are going to be submitted once we send out the book. Looking at things as basic, in terms of basic science, is what happens to kids' delayed discounting values over the course of a year of working on this curriculum, which is pretty cool because we're not teaching kids to save and wait for larger amounts of money, but what happens to their impulsive behavior, to is measured by those types of scales, to things that matter, like how many challenging behaviors do you emit during the course of 6-month period of time after being exposed to the curriculum. So we've got a variety of things coming out, larger and kind of system analyses, as well as individual kid reductions in problem behavior.
Are you able to, and don't feel like you have to just because I'm asking, and then I know sometimes you might not be able to do it for other reasons, but are you able to talk about some of the outlets that these studies might be seen in, or is it that premature?
Well, we're sending some of them to the traditional behavior analytic journals, and then some of them to the probably friendlier JCBS and the kind of ACT type journals.
I see.
I mean, what, again, as for better or worse, I'm pushing against the status quo, and here we're going to be introducing this thing that's called ACT, that's been somewhat outside of the circle of traditional behavior analysis, even though it is behavior analytic, and saying we can use these mid-level terms, and we can talk about things like values when they really are reinforcers, conceptually within a behavioral system, and we can speak about mindfulness and these somewhat cognitive sounding concepts. But by doing so, if we use those as our means to behavioral change as the end, maybe there's some value to incorporating them within the applied behavior analytic community that they always should have been in the first place.
I see. Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing some of those results. And I had a feeling that you guys were probably researching the heck out of this prior to publication. So, how has it been kind of rolling this out? I know the reason why I asked that is the term mindfulness can be, for some people, I think, appealing, depending on your point of view or what have you, or your experiences with it. And I have to imagine the other side of the coin is that some people's like, oh my God, if I hear another thing about mindfulness because they've seen it on Yahoo News or read about it and here or there, and they're just maybe, or they think it's, It's just going to turn me into a Buddhist or make me meditate or do all the so people might have preconceived notions or hangups and things like that. And perhaps the other side of that coin is people thinking mindfulness is the panacea, and they're and perhaps, I don't know, maybe applied too broadly, where some other intervention methodology might be more appropriate. So I'm just wondering if that term itself, or are there other aspects of the AIM curriculum that have made rolling it out challenging, or maybe I'm making this up. It's been received, wonderfully well, or whatever. Tell me a little bit about what it's like, kind of introducing this to a school community or culture.
Well, I mean, I think they're the ones that are going to be more excited about it than the behavioral community. I think that it was intentionally done to have that Yahoo, pop culture vibe to it, because, I think, and, I've talked about this before with you, Matt, that, we can design beautiful interventions that nobody cares about but us, and they're fantastic, but nobody cares about them. And I'm sick of doing that. And I think that our field is going to be left behind once again if we can't, expand what the scope of what behavior analysis is, what we define it as. And so I'm going to use those pop terms, and I'm going to not talk in a technical vocabulary. And you know what? I'm going to go get some change out of people's lives that need it.
So the mindfulness language. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the mindfulness language was not necessarily off-putting or to a kind of to a school environment, because I'm really thinking very literally about this, because I'm thinking like, okay, I've got kids I can totally that I think would totally benefit from this. I do worry a little bit about how people might receive the some of the more I guess less tangible aspects of this.
Well, the one thing, and again, Dan and I talk about this in the intro to the book, is that, mindfulness is cool, I guess, and it seems to work. But you need a reason to want to be mindful. Like, I remember doing some of this work with my daughter early on, because again, I'm married to a behavior analyst. Our kids are definitely going to be in our studies. So we, I remember working with her on being mindful, and she was upset about something one day. And I said, you just need to be in the present moment. You need to be mindful. She said, why? The present moment sucks. And I kind of had to pause there for a second and think, yeah, I don't know if I got an answer for you.
You didn't say because I said so?
No, I eventually did, but it was kind of one of those moments where, like, dang it, I think she might have like just crashed the entire philosophy of mindfulness, because I agreed with her. And so what this ACT part does, and what the contingency management element as well of this curriculum does, is it puts, it kind of sets up contingencies, it sets up rules, for why you might want to sit and be mindful. Like, what is the utility of it for you? Because mindfulness for mindfulness sake seems kind of empty. And I think that as behavior analysts, we want to look at what are the controlling variables, why do we care about this stuff? And for my daughter in that moment, I had to, I thought about it for weeks, and I was thinking, dang it, I think the reason why you need to be mindful is because if you are, you end up getting to these better things that you will miss out on if you get entrenched in what happened in the past and perseverating on that stuff. And so what this book tries to do, and what this curriculum tries to do, is to kind of harness the utility of staying in the present or being mindful, but then give you reason to do that, and reason to play these silly games, and reasons to try to buy these rules that we're giving you, this verbal kind of instruction following, because there are these other things that you value in your life that you're going to miss out on if you don't do this. And so that's what ACT adds, I think, to the mindful, the mindfulness kind of culture, is that whole second half of the hexaplex. That's that side of identifying things that are important to you, and then and committing and moving towards that stuff. And then what we try to do with that third element, the contingency management, the applied behavior analysis part, is to link the stuff to observable behavior and not keep it in this kind of lofty world of thoughts and emotions, which is something that behavior analysts often struggle with. And, again, I believe it or not, I was trained as a behavior analyst. And so, that's always been a, kind of a hard part for me when I teach this stuff and when I try to implement it is, what are we really trying to measure in terms of success? It's not, necessarily just, hey, I feel better, but I want to see behavior change. Again, I'm a behavior analyst. And so could we use these higher order concepts that deal with language and thoughts, which is what we all have once we become verbal? And could we use those tools to get us what we as behavior analysts want, what these teachers want, which is behavior change from the kids? And because you know what, DROs can only take us so far once you start talking. Differential reinforcement procedures are only so much when you've got this whole language element laid on top of the program contingencies. And so what are we doing to intervene with language?
I
And
see.
that's what this is all about.
All right, cool. So can you talk a little bit more about, I know there's like a point system and you did some nice little twist to the traditional kind of antecedent behavior consequence form. You want to talk about, again, some of how that stuff works?
So AIM includes a whole system for function-based reinforcement. Dr. Dixon was talking about a lot of the contingency management stuff that we've embedded. Basically, we have a point system put in place, and kids are reinforced for appropriate behavior, the same way you would in kind of any typical function-based point system. But we also have a component for reinforcing specifically ACT-related or mindfulness-related flexible behaviors. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach where we're providing reinforcement for saying, hey, you didn't punch anybody today. Here's your reinforcer. But also you were able to be present and say, I wanted to, in that moment, punch somebody, but I remembered that what I care about is this, and I chose not to. And for, like Dr. Dixon was saying, that language component, we want to reinforce those behaviors as well. So I think that's kind of the approach. So we have a number of different point sheets to be used within different settings. So in a school setting, in a one-on-one, in-home setting, in a clinic setting, wherever you might be working with kids, there are point sheets and systematic ways of providing reinforcement. That's all linked back to a point store. So different function-based reinforcers available kind of continuously to the kids. Once they've earned these points, they can, cash out, earn things that are all based on the function of their own behavior at regular intervals throughout the day.
Right. One of the things that I saw repeatedly in visiting classrooms or even looking at one-on-one type intervention sessions was that kids were working for stuff. They were working for tangibles, but their behaviors were being maintained by escape. They were being maintained by attention seeking. And we're trying to override those functions by giving them a movie on Friday, giving them a treasure box item, giving them stuff, when what they were wanting to engage in the problem behavior for was for things that were other than tangible reinforcers. And so, as we know in applied behavior analytic research, those non-functional consequences only yield so much power over the contingent relationship of problem behavior and consequences. So that all, we try to tear that all down and say, okay, if you're going to have a treasure box or you're going to have a stupid movie on Friday, let's have options in your economy that are all that are going to span across all four functions of behavior. So what kind of attention seeking things do you have in your store? Well, none. What kind of escape items do you have for these kids? Well, we have none. And so, let's put some of that stuff in. And so in the book, we walk through what are some various potential tangible, those are pretty easy to figure out. What are some potential escape things that you could do, like skip half an assignment, take a 5-minute break, go for a walk, What are some attention seeking things that you could do? You could sit in the teacher's chair. You could stand up in front of the class and tell a joke. I mean, just a variety of different, items that could be acquired for behaving well during the day. And so, you can think about it as, it's kind of like a token economy. And depending on the level of the kid and the environment that you're in, it literally could be tokens. It could be points on a board. It could be, something in between. But the kids are going to have set intervals for the delivery of consequences that both address behaviors that we're looking for in the classroom, of following the rules, paying attention, whatever you want to operationally define it as. Again, that's up to you. And then also emitting or demonstrating behaviors that we would deem as act relevant, where they were, as Dana said, accepting of something that they didn't want to do. They did the math worksheet. Typically, they rip up their math worksheet, but today they got it done. And so not only are we going to reinforce completion, but we're going to say, hey, you know what? Tell me about what you wanted to do here. Did you want to rip that thing up, or did you want to do it? No, I wanted to rip it up, but I did it anyhow. Why did you want to do it? And so we kind of use those as teachable moments of acceptance, or of any of the elements of ACT, right there in the moment, and then give these kids, points in the economy, or positive consequences for emitting and demonstrating these ACT relevant behaviors. And then together, those things add up, and then they can cash out at various times of the day to acquire tangible or sensory or attention seeking or escape functional consequences. Again, I mean, there's a lot of mechanics here that I don't know are worth diving into, at a general overview, right now, but it's set up in a way that, as Dana mentioned, that you could have this built within a one-on-one session that you might do with a child once a week. We do it here, at our clinic. We might see a kid once a week, and we have a different kind of modified system for that, where they might be doing some self-monitoring. The parents might be doing some data capturing for us. We have it, kind of what I've been articulating a lot here, in a classroom type setting. We have it set up so that it could be one kid that might be having some supports in regular ed that's running around with a point sheet that staff are scoring him on throughout the day as he moves classes. So there's a lot of different variations here to address the necessity of, trying to improve psychological well-being with this function-based approach, across many different types of kids.
I see. So before we get too far into this conversation, we're recording this on October 27th, and I'm not sure at this part, or at least at this point in time, when we're going to publish this episode. It'll be in the near future, I guess. But when is this book available, and where can people get it?
Well, the book will be available, I would say, within the next month. Right before we started this call, we just got the final proofs on the cover, and the full text is done, and we are just going through copy edits right now on it.
Cool. And where will it be available?
It will be available on the Shawnee Scientific website, as well as probably some other outlets that we're negotiating with right now.
Okay, cool. And I'll be sure to put those, excuse me, I know the Shawnee website, so I'll put that in the show notes. So if people want to go check it out, or check out some of the other stuff that's there, they can do so. So another thought I had, Mark, was that I know in some of your published work, you've encouraged people to test your curricula independently.
Yeah.
So I have to imagine there's someone who will be listening to this episode who might be a graduate student. They might be in a master's or doc program, or perhaps a faculty member looking for something to, looking for useful interventions for these types of populations. What would you suggest perhaps are some low-hanging fruit, if you will, as far as research questions as it relates to this curriculum?
I think the easiest thing would be to find 3 individuals with challenging behavior that could probably benefit from an intervention that was beyond a typical differential reinforcement type of procedure, and do a multiple baseline across them, where during baseline you just record the number of reported incidences at home or at school or whatever those, the setting is that you're looking at, of challenging behaviors per day. And then you would introduce a variety of the elements that are within the AIM curriculum as the independent variable, as a treatment package, and then continue to record how problem behavior hopefully reduces upon introduction of that curriculum. Now, problem behavior could be, again, this is not meant for kids that we can, use basic principles of behavior with, just simple, modification of contingencies. But these are the kind of kids, that are, oftentimes emitting, low frequency, high intensity behaviors, like, getting kicked out of, a class or kicked out of school, once every couple days, or, something like that, rather than, high rates, within an hour period of time. That would be one intervention, and the behaviors could be, either something overt like those, countable, measurable problem behaviors, or they could be something a little bit more covert or private event related, where we could have them, just have them fill out we've got a number of scales in there related to mindfulness, like, well, how does their score on these mindfulness scales change over the course of the intervention? You might do that like in a multiple probe design. So, I mean, that would be a real easy one to do. I think another easy one to do would be to find a teacher that had a stoplight system to manage behavior in the classroom, and maybe put half the kids, randomly assign half the kids to this new point-based system that we're talking about here, the other half of the kids to stay on the stoplight and look at how many times kids are getting in trouble in the room. Another one could be, if you want to scale it up, where you could take, we've done some stuff where we've taken, a whole school where they just announce the tier 1 comments, or tier 1 act, comments. And again, it's like 2 to 3 sentences, literally, every day with morning announcements, and then compare number of bully reports, number of suspensions, number of, whatever you want to do at a school-wide level, compare that school to a school that just stays status quo, with some of those empty slogans that we often hear about.
I see. Cool.
So, those are real easy things that could be done.
All right. I knew that that question was going to result in quite a number of responses. So, all right, cool. Well, I've got a handful of listener questions here, and many of them do revolve around peak. So, are there any other AIM-related things that our listeners should know that I haven't thought about to ask?
Well, I think that this, I'm very, I think I speak for both Dana and myself, and that we're very proud of this final product, and it's been a long time coming. It really has been a long road to get us to kind of release this thing that has been actually been implemented for almost a decade in many classrooms within Illinois and some of the other areas that I've been involved with. And so it's exciting for us, and I think it'll have a lot of utility for behavior analysts that don't know what to do once these kids start talking and have these high or order complex repertoires that often result in them worrying about stuff and perseverating on things. That we tend to think is not behavior analytic. And what we try to do in this book is to walk the reader through, specifically, the behavior analyst, through how does this fit within your scope of practice? How does doing this weird, touchy-feely mindfulness and ACT stuff actually fit in the umbrella of being a behavior analyst? And so we provide a number of tables on, your scope of practice and your codes of competency, and how this ACT stuff actually can fit in there, because this is a language-based intervention that is behavior analytic. While it uses this weird kind of touchy-feely vernacular to get people to buy into it, it really is behavior analytic, and we try to take that touchy-feely vernacular and then kind of bring it back down to basic behavioral processes that all relate to derived relational responding, and all relate to the kind of the foundational uh, elements of what relational frame theory is. So, there's a lot of what we try to do in here, as well as to give the reader or the user the materials they need to go grab this book and start working on it with clients, is also that bridge between where kind of traditional behavior analysis left off, and then this whole new wave of these higher order language based interventions that we've been kind of shy to grab onto. So this is the natural progression, and we try to link the two together. I feel, with some interesting, discussion, as well as kind of point by point comparisons of here's item X on the BCBA task list, and here is how this part of ACT makes sense within that scope. So I think that's something that will be very helpful to readers as they, think about whether or not they should do this, as well as the critics who are going to think about whether or not this is behavior analytic enough.
I see. That's an interesting point, in that anyone who's kind of hung around schools and tried to do some behavior analytic work in schools, at a certain point with certain kiddos, you see often we'll just refer them to counseling.
Yeah.
Refer them to counseling, and then they go, see the counselor, and the counselor, is doing some, they might be doing some sort of therapy that's not necessarily based in the soundest of science or whatever, and whatever the counseling is not really making a difference in the kiddo's day-to-day life and things like that. And so I think a lot of behavior analysts might feel kind of handcuffed by that, but at the same time give the guidance in terms of what, where you should and shouldn't practice, I think will also be helpful. So good points. So all right, cool. Again, I look forward to checking out the full text here, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will as well.
Let me just say one more thing about
Sure.
the book, is that, related to that practice issue, is that at no point in this book, and at no point in this conversation, do I want to encourage people to do psychotherapy and
Sure.
to be doing things that are beyond what their scope of practice is. And also, we are very clear in there that if you're not measuring um, observable behavior and things that are behavior analytic, you better refer those kids to those social workers or those therapists in order to treat those things. I mean, if you have children with psychiatric conditions, you have trauma, you have significant emotional distress. And these are not things that are just convenient hypothetical constructs for observable behavior. Those kind of kids, you got to get them to the right people.
Sure.
And we very carefully articulate what, at least in general guidelines, when you need to call in the others to help, because this is not the shortcut for a behavior analyst to become a psychotherapist. That's a dangerous misconception.
Well, in previous shows that we've done about ACT, and especially talking, I think in your first appearance on the podcast about the ACT for Children with Autism and Emotional Challenges book, that is one of the things that I think oftentimes comes up when behavior analysts attend these ACT trainings, like, whoa, where do I start and where do I leave off and things like that. So that clarification is helpful. So all right, cool. So let's get to some listener questions here. All right. And so this one is a nice little transition, I guess, question. So Sarah Murphy writes in and asks, is there a point in the peak transformation module at which lessons from ACT for children with autism and emotional challenges begin to be integrated into programming? She's obviously has the Mark Dixon box set. So
that's, I guess, kind of flattering. I'm going to let Dana answer that, actually, and then I'll respond as well too.
Obviously, as you go through the transformation book, you start dealing with more complex language. So it's probably a clinical choice as to when it's appropriate to start doing ACT activities. However, the last set of programs in the transformation module, I think it's the last 8, are directly related to ACT in some way. So we start literally talking about values or acceptance or diffusion in the context of discrete trial training. So I think that's an obvious segue. However, you might want to start earlier than that.
Yeah, I mean, we, in our clinic here, when kids, kind of start displaying either challenging behaviors or self-emitted rules that seem to be able to be addressed using ACT processes, we might take an ABA kid, a discrete trial type kid, a P kid, and put half of their time into running ACT lessons with them. And so there is a natural transition. I think that once you're able to derive, you derive in bad ways in addition to the good ways we're working on with you, and that derivation into these kind of emotionally funky places of I get this homework assignment and it makes me feel worried, and I'm worried, so I'm not going to do it, so I'm going to rip it up, is no longer just a escape from work demand. You got another element of private events going on there that can be dealt with ACT. So we will often do both when those kids become more language sophisticated. And we have some data, of course, that shows that the more that you're able to derive, the less kind of psychologically entangled you are, as measured by things like the acceptance and action questionnaire, the AAQ, and some of these other ACT measures. So there seems to be a kind of an inverse relationship with the more flexible you are with your the more successful you are with your higher order peak stuff, the more successful you tend to be when it comes to ACT work as well.
I see. So a few more questions from Sarah. She sent in a couple here. Let's see. How does peak life, another another word from another Shawnee Press book, how does peak life compare to the AFLS? And she also asked about updates on peak electronic data collection systems.
So Sarah's got a whole bunch of questions, I guess. Huh?
Right. I think, Sarah, you should just move to Carbondale and
Peak Life is going to it's going to come out in 2018. Let me start there, I guess, and it's going to be a kind of a life skill curriculum that is going to kind of plug into the original Peak curriculum. The reason why like a lot of things that I've heard over the years of doing Peak Talks and the trainings has been that people want to know, well, why don't you have all these life skill things in the curriculum? It seems very academic. It seems very much like you've skipped over things like self-feeding and toileting and all these other things that we find in some of this other life skill or some of the other programs and assessments. And my response, initially was, well, hey, I gave you the latitude under like 1-step direction following, or 2-step motor imitation, or 3-step, sequencing of motor tasks in the Peak curriculum to plug in any of those life skill topographies that you wanted. But even though that answer, at least it was sufficient to me, doesn't seem sufficient to others that want that kind of laundry list of life skill things to do. At the other end of the age span, what I was finding in with the original Peak work was that those high school students that might be now, getting ready to transition out to work, were teachers or ABA therapists would kind of push back a little bit and say, well, I don't know if this person needs to know these basic things like letters and numbers and colors and a lot of the tasks that we had in the early Peak stuff, or the lower level Peak stuff, when they should be learning how to do some of these life skill things like get on a bus and assemble a sandwich to make their lunch and things like that. And so in order to address the kind of the persistence for these topographies of life skills, I decided, all right, I'll give you the list, but I'm going to do it in a way that also incorporates, the most unique elements of what peak was, which was to teach people how to derive and not just, task analysis, task analyze of 500 ways to go about successful living. So it was really going to be not only those skills that I think people are hoping for, but they're going to be taught in ways that build on the science of derived relational response.
Got it. And then, is there any electronic data collection systems for peak in the works? Is that
Oh yeah,
all
yeah,
right?
and it's going to be beautiful. That's all I'm gonna say.
Clearly,
Got yeah, and we have a programming team, and it's being done outside of behavior analysis. In terms of we've got some pretty elegant software designers, and I've seen betas of it already. We're going to be running some beta programs, and working with some therapists here in house before it's released, but it's coming soon.
very cool. Let's see. Christy Marie asks, how often do you reassess when using the peak system? Will train? Oh, this is more of a pointed question about training at the conference, but I guess she's probably referring to training at perhaps ABAI, but basically, she's asking if how often do you reassess, and will the training focus on interventions both in home and school settings?
Yeah, I give a lot of latitude back to the clinician to make these calls in terms of what's more relevant, what's relevant to the child. So we might have kids that will assess in a district at the beginning of the year and at the end of the school year. In the clinic here on campus, how often you assess them?
Well, we work on kind of a semester calendar, so we'll usually at the beginning of every semester do a new round of assessments.
Yeah, and then something, I would say at least once a year for sure. And I would say also probably not any more than once a quarter, because you don't want to have practice effects. But those are, I'm just giving random ideas out at this point, or guidance. And I think that's an empirical question in terms of, the durability of those test scores or those assessment scores over repeated testings. So that would be a great thesis for somebody as well.
All right. We're getting more research ideas from Dr. Dixon here. All right. So Celia Heyman from the ABA study group, she asks if there's any update on new research for the peak. What's going on research wise, and is there anything that you've got cooking that you can tell us about?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. We've probably got
Apparently, yeah.
Like 15 papers that are in either accept or peer review, in the peer review process right now, either accepted with revisions in press. God, maybe even 20 at this point. So there's a lot that's happening.
So maybe to narrow the focus of the question, is there any finding that you're that you didn't expect, or you're really excited about, or
Yeah, there's a lot. I think the one that I'm most excited about would be that it appears that we were able to change IQ after administration of all 4 modules, but we can't change it as much if we just do the first 2.
Okay.
So that means that derived relational responding seems to be a core element of intelligence. And when we've done this in a randomized controlled trial, so kind of the gold standard of research outside of behavior analysis, and we've seen some pretty important changes, I think, happen. We've also seen some changes with executive function and some of these other kind of non-behavioral metrics. Now, behavior analysts might not be that excited about it, but to me, and I think as we try to scale these interventions up beyond our little club, these are the things that people are going to pay attention to. These are the things that are going to change policy. And so that's the stuff I'm really excited about. Now, within the behavioral, culture, we got some really cool, single subject designs showing some really neat things on, teaching some of these relational frames that have only theoretically been kind of narrative, kind of talked about as useful for kids with autism. And now we've got some really neat data showing some pretty powerful behavior changes within an individual child.
Nice, nice. All right. So the
Well, let me
last question is more.
let me add one more thing there.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm most excited about, even though I'm really excited about those things because there's stuff that I'm
Yeah,
attached
it
to.
sounds really cool.
The thing that I'm, I guess, most excited about is that I've seen and I'm kind of become aware of other people and other labs that are now doing peak research. And one of the downsides of me, holding that work and then submitting everything right when the books come out is that we get all these papers out and then nobody else has anything. They haven't had time to submit any work yet. As a result, it looks like Dixon and his crew are just pumping out stuff on their own, and we need to make sure that other folks can replicate it. So what I'm most excited about is that we're seeing some of those replications start to show up in the literature. Either they're in press or I've been made aware of some data sets that seem to be replicating what we found, which is like I never doubted people would, but I think others may have. And so that's exciting for me to see that this has transcended me and my little group into other researchers.
Yeah, good point. And as I said earlier, you've been very clear about wanting people to
Yeah.
test this stuff out, take it for a ride, and report how it does. So the last question is more or less a composite question of several that I got. And again, I'm going to sound, or it might sound like it's like the Peak/ACT fan club, like all wrote in, of which I'd be a member of. So I'm not casting aspersions, but so basically, folks like Celia, Louisa, and Tara, and several more, they just want they want to be trained in this stuff. They're excited about it. They want to learn more.
Yeah.
And so some of the questions are very specific, when are you coming to this area or that area, whatever. And rather than kind of list out the various geographical questions of where you're going to be or where the peak patrol is going,
Yeah.
you know, can you talk a little bit about how you're training people and how that is going? But also, are there going to be any online trainings or anything else in the realm of getting people not
Okay.
just the books in their hands,
Yes.
but more capable with the curricula?
Yeah. Let me start off with telling you about a relatively new and I think very powerful event, which is going to be a boot camp for behavior analysts, or it's an ACT boot camp, 4 days long. That's going to be held in March in Reno, Nevada. That's designed specifically for behavior analysts to understand ACT from the beginnings, the historical foundation of it, how it grew out of RFT, what RFT is, applications of ACT to kids, to adults, to schools, to homes, to parents, to organizations. So that's going to be a really, I think, important and once in a long number of years opportunity to see myself, Ruth Ann Rayfeld, Tom Sasbo, Jonathan Tarbox, and then of course Steve Hayes in one setting, a very intimate 4-day event for folks that would probably never get that kind of list of presenters in one place at one time. So that's one thing that people could go to. Another one is, when it comes to the peak trainings, while I enjoy doing them, I have a real job during the day, as a professor. And so I have allowed Dr. Megan Miller to kind of form a corporation that is in charge of delivering peak trainings throughout the world. And her and a number of trainers, I'm one of them as well, will continue. I'll continue to go out from time to time, but there's a number of people that have really mastered this approach that are out there doing trainings on a much more frequent basis than I ever could individually. So people can find out more about that at peakabasolutions.com, which is kind of the training wing of Peak now. I'll give you an example. In a couple of weeks, there'll be a training going on in Dubai, in the United Kingdom, and in Boston area all on the same day. So, we're really trying to, or I should say, Megan's really trying to get the word out far beyond what I was ever able to do as an individual person, with some free time every couple months to do one of these trainings.
Also, if people aren't aware, there's a Peak Relational Training System Facebook page and forum where Dr. Megan Miller and other people are constantly letting people know when new trainings pop up and how you can register for them and where they're going to be. So for people who are just trying to figure out where to go and how they can go, that's a really good place to get really current information.
And I guess to a lesser extent too, or perhaps obviously a few spaces down on the rigor meter, but important, I think, nonetheless, is I think you guys have done a good job with the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
So if people just have the books, they're like, well, how the hell do you run that? It's been fun to. I've been a subscriber to the YouTube channel, and it's always fun to see a new edition. It's like, oh, okay, that's what they meant by that. And
the YouTube channel is awesome. It really is. Like, I kind of worry to some degree that we won't need to train anybody anymore out there in the real world, because they can just watch the YouTube channel for any program that we have, which is cool. And those girls do an absolutely fabulous job bringing those programs to life. And they take requests.
I've made a request.
I have too. I want
couple myself.
I want the flip books for the transformation and equivalence modules. That's good. I'm going to publicly announce that request. So.
Yeah, no, they're coming. Don't worry. They're
coming. All right. I've got the generalization and direct training one, but that's just the cool thing about those, especially those flip books. And for those who don't know, there's some kind of you guys probably can describe it better than I can. But some of the assessment materials that are downloadable just saves kind of hours of time collecting resources and things like that. And so one of the things I think people are really digging about this curriculum, and again, I'm going to sound like the leader of the Peak fanboy club again, but is that they are very user friendly, and especially those of us who are consulting to people with less behavior analytic training, having those materials that are kind of, I don't want to say canned. That probably sounds more pejorative than what my intent is. But they're just very user friendly, I guess, is what I'll say. So
yeah, and I'd agree with that. I think that those flip books were designed to be that large scale dissemination attempt to get this into the hands of people, like you said, that might not have as much behavior analytic training. Now, it remains an empirical question of, how well do they do with, administration of the assessment, appropriately identifying goals for the kids, so that all still needs to be done, in terms of work. And, while I've said this in our initial interview on Peak is, I don't have any clue if this is the best thing ever. And I don't ever want to promote it as it is. But I do think that we've got some data. The data seem to be looking pretty good, but they're the beginning of the conversation, definitely not the end of it. And people will be critical of our data, because I'm an author on it. People will be critical of the data because we have too small sample sizes, whatever. But again, what I hope is that, if nothing else, those data in this curriculum further the sophistication of what we are implementing out there in the real world. And I'm sure at some point, some of the flaws of Peak will be revealed, and we'll probably find them as well as other people. So, but the flip books are awesome. I think that the first day that we put up the direct module flip book, there were over 8,000 downloads within one day.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's incredible. Yep. So, and for those of you guys who are listening to this and don't know anything about what we're talking about, I will post a link to the Flipbook YouTube demonstration so you can check it out. So you can go to behavioralobservations.com, look for the Mark and Dana episode, and I'll have that stuff in the show notes there. So, well, I looking at the clock here, I'm realizing we're kind of running up on the allotted time. Are there any final thoughts, whether it be related to AIM, Peak, ACT, RFT, anything, or anything under the sun as it relates to some of the things we've touched upon today?
I think that while these are all different kind of appendages of a general theme, what I've tried to do and what I've brought Dana in to be part of is kind of a movement of taking what we've known about in the behavior analytic literature for decades and translating it into a way that those frontline users can get at. Because as I've told my backstory before, is that, all that knowledge and all that sophistication that we have in our science, if it just stays in our journals, was done for nothing. And I've written a lot of those papers, and I see, wow, I wrote this awesome paper that took me a year to get the data on, and 42 people have downloaded it in the last decade. I mean, that's just heartbreaking,
Yeah.
And when you see, that one of these little flip books downloads 8,000 in 24 hours, you realize that, we better kind of start taking our science and making it truly applied, and not just letting it sit in these controlled studies in clinics, but rather, how are we going to take this out to that front line? Because that there is a massive population of frontline behavior analysts that are just dying for resources that they can use tomorrow. Not ones that they can read in the journals and try to figure out how the hell this is going to fit into practice, but stuff that they can put into practice immediately. And so while I've played a role in it, I brought on Dana on this new book to play a part of it. It's got to be more than us. And I encourage everybody out there that is an applied behavior analytic researcher to take that next step into evolving what they do in the journals into things that are going to be tangible materials for people out there in the real world.
Very cool. Well, Dana and Mark, it's been great to have you on and talk about this stuff. And we'll have to have you back on down the road once we start getting some more experience in terms of seeing how this AIM curriculum sorts itself out, and perhaps talk about some of the research outcomes that you guys are seeing and things like that. So I think you'll have quite a bit of folks who'll be interested in hearing more about this.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys. Take care. Well, folks, there you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode with Mark and Dana. I want to give another shout out to Chartlytics for sponsoring this episode. And if you want any references, resources, etc. that we mention in this program, again, your one-stop source for all those things is behavioralobservations.com/session 40. So thanks so much for listening. And if you get a chance, it would be awesome if you can do a review on iTunes. We've got about 122, but who's counting really? But we've got 122 reviews on iTunes. Thank goodness most of them are 5 stars, and have gotten a lot of really nice comments. And one other thing about the iTunes reviews that I want to mention is that those are the reviews from the United States iTunes store. So if you are one of the international listeners, one of the many international listeners, is almost 20%, as a matter of fact. 20% of the downloads are coming from outside of the United States, which I think is pretty cool. I can't see your reviews, so if you want to screenshot them and email them to me at matt@behavioralobservations.com, that will allow me to see your feedback on the show. So thanks again for joining me for another episode of the Behavioral Observations podcast, and I will see you in session 41. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.